My parents sued me over my grandpa's inheritance. But when I walked in, the judge stood up and said, "My parents sued me right after my grandfather, New Mexico's most renowned judge, passed away. They claimed I had manipulated the elderly to seize their assets." I didn't say a word. I simply presented the only evidence, the diary they had once torn to pieces. That day in court, the judge looked at me for a long moment and asked, "Excuse me, are you?" "Hello, my name is Nathan Miller. I'm 31 years old and currently a prosecutor for the state of New Mexico, living and working in Santa Fe, where I was born and raised. If you ask me about my life story, I wouldn't know where to begin, because it feels like an old book, its first pages yellowed, filled with memories I both want to hold close and let go of. But perhaps to understand who I am today, you need to know about those early days, the days I was left behind, but also loved more than I ever thought I deserved. Santa Fe is a small town steeped in southwestern charm, with red dirt roads and adobe houses nestled under blazing golden sunlight. It's where I was born, but not where I was raised with the love of my parents. My father, Hudson Miller, was once a basketball star. Tall, strong, with a smile that could charm anyone. By 25, he was a high-earning athlete with endorsement deals and tours across the country. My mother, Lainey Miller, was a sharp, ambitious young reporter. She had golden blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a voice that could silence a room when she spoke of the stories she chased. They were a perfect couple, at least on the surface, living fast, loving passionately, and spending money like it was water. But I didn't belong to their glittering world. I was an accident, an unexpected twist they neither anticipated nor wanted to keep. According to my grandfather, when I was 1 year old, my parents showed up at my grandparents' home on the outskirts of Santa Fe, leaving me with a small bag of clothes and a vague promise to return for me soon. They never kept that promise. They left me there like one might forget an unimportant belonging. And so, I became part of my grandparents' home. Judge David Miller and Willow, the kindest woman I've ever known. My grandparents' house sat at the end of a quiet road, surrounded by towering pines and a garden full of wildflowers. It wasn't large or luxurious, but it was always warm, as if my grandparents' love seeped into every brick and window pane. My grandfather, David Miller, was a renowned judge in Santa Fe. Tall and lean, with silver hair and deep brown eyes that seemed to see right through you, searching for the truth. He was a strict man, but he never made me feel afraid. Instead, he made me feel safe, as if as long as he was there, the world would never fall apart. My grandmother, Willow, was an entirely different piece of the puzzle. Petite, with a gentle smile and hands always busy kneading dough for bread or pruning plants in the garden. She would sing old folk songs. Her voice wasn't particularly beautiful, but it was brimming with emotion. Every time I heard her sing, it felt like being wrapped in an embrace. She taught me how to make cornbread, how to plant sunflower seeds, and how to care for others, not just with actions, but with your heart. I grew up in that house, surrounded by evenings where my grandfather read law books under the glow of a lamp, and mornings where my grandmother dragged me to the garden to teach me how to identify each plant. My grandfather loved telling me about old cases, stories of justice and truth. He shared them not to boast, but to make me understand that no matter how chaotic the world was, there were rules to keep it balanced. Justice, Nathan, he once said, isn't about winning. It's about protecting what's right. I still remember the afternoons when he taught me to play chess on an old wooden board in the living room. He always let me go first, but he never let me win. "You have to learn to fight fair, Nathan," he'd say, his eyes twinkling as if challenging me. Those chess games taught me not just strategy, but patience, the importance of thinking before acting, and taking responsibility for every move I made. But not everything in my childhood was sunshine and laughter. There were moments, often at night, when I lay in my small bed, wondering about my parents. Where were they? What were they doing? Why did they leave me? Why didn't they want me? Those questions were like small stones quietly piling up in my heart, making me feel like a puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere. One evening, when I was about 7, I sat with my grandfather in the living room. Outside, the Santa Fe wind whispered through the pines. I held a chess piece, turning it in my hand, and finally mustered the courage to ask the question that had haunted me for so long. "Grandpa, why aren't my parents here with me?" He paused, his hand hovering over a knight. His eyes met mine, not with pity, but with profound sincerity. He set the piece down, sighed, and said, "Nathan, in this world, some people choose to live for themselves. They chase joy, freedom, or whatever makes them feel alive. But others choose to live for others, for something greater than themselves. Your parents, they chose their own path. But you're here and we chose you." Those words, simple yet sharp, etched themselves into my mind like a carving. They didn't erase the pain, but they gave me a way to understand it. I wasn't a child abandoned. I was a child chosen, loved, and raised by two people who devoted their lives to what was right. In the years that followed, I grew up in that house, shaped by my grandfather's lessons about justice and my grandmother's embraces. I learned how to make cornbread without burning it, how to tell when a plant needed water, and how to read the thick law books my grandfather left on the table. But above all, I learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to stay, no matter where life takes them. I didn't know then that years later, my parents would return, not to find me, but to claim what they thought they deserved. Nor did I know that in my journey to adulthood, I would face greater pain and deeper losses, but also discover the true meaning of justice, not just in the courtroom, but in my own heart. Derelict house, the reappearance. 13 years had passed since I was placed in the arms of my grandparents in their small house on the outskirts of Santa Fe, where the scent of red earth and green pines permeated every memory. I was 14 now, a lanky teenager with messy brown hair, and eyes always fixed on my grandfather's old law books or the sunflower patches in my grandmother's garden. Santa Fe remained largely unchanged, but within me, the world was growing larger and more complicated. My grandfather, David Miller, was still the respected judge, putting on his black suit jacket every morning as if carrying the weight of the law itself. But I began to notice deeper wrinkles on his forehead, and his eyes sometimes drifted as if lost in distant thought. My grandmother, Willow, was as gentle as ever, but I could see she was growing tired. In the mornings, she would pause to catch her breath, hand clutching her chest, her smile faint as if hiding something. I didn't dare ask, but I knew time was taking something precious from her. I was a good student, not because I was exceptionally bright, but because I didn't want to disappoint my grandparents. Every good grade, every compliment from a teacher, I brought home like small gifts to see the smiles on their faces. My grandfather still taught me chess, but now I was starting to win a few games. "You're learning to see further, Nathan," he said, his voice full of pride. But then everything changed when my parents, Hudson and Lainey, started reappearing. The first time they came, I was sitting at the kitchen table working on math homework while my grandmother baked. A loud, firm knock echoed through the house. Then a familiar man's voice called out, "Dad, open the door. It's me." My grandmother whispered softly, her eyes flickering with worry. "It's Hudson." My heart raced, not with joy, but with a strange feeling, as if I was about to face something I couldn't control. I ran to open the door. My parents looked momentarily surprised to see me, then quickly regained their composure. My father stepped inside, still tall, but his once jet-black hair was now flecked with gray, and his smile no longer shone. My mother walked beside him, still beautiful, but her blue eyes were colder, as if life had worn away her warmth. They hugged me, but the embrace was brief and awkward, more a formality than affection. "You've grown so much, Nathan," my mother said, but her gaze slid past me as if I were just part of the room. They didn't stay long. My father sat down and began talking about their struggles. A failed investment, a canceled endorsement deal, a debt that needed to be paid urgently. My mother chimed in, her voice sweet but sharp, asking my grandfather for a small loan. My grandfather listened, his expression unchanging, but I saw his hand grip the edge of the table tightly. My grandmother stood behind the kitchen counter, silent, her hands trembling as she poured tea. My grandparents agreed to help, not because they wanted to, but because they didn't want me to witness an argument. In the visits that followed, my parents came more frequently. Each time, The story was the same. Promises to return, half-hearted apologies, and requests for money wrapped in forced smiles. I began to realize a painful truth. They only came to me and my grandparents when they needed money. "Nathan, how are you? Do you need anything?" my father would ask. But moments later, he'd turn to my grandfather, his voice lowering. "Dad, I just need this one last time." My mother would try to draw me into stories about her glamorous life, as if to make me forget the years they'd left me behind. But I didn't forget. Couldn't. One autumn night, when the Santa Fe wind blew so fiercely that the windows rattled, I overheard an argument from the living room. I had gone to bed, but my father's sharp voice jolted me awake. I tiptoed down the hallway, standing behind the slightly open wooden door, my heart pounding. My father stood in the middle of the room, his voice so loud it drowned out the wind. "You always think you're right, don't you? You think I'm not good enough, not worthy of this family." My grandfather sat in his armchair, his voice low but firm. "Hudson, I never said you weren't worthy. But you chose your way of life, a way I can't understand. You left Nathan, your son, and now you come here not to apologize, but to demand more." "Demand?" my father nearly shouted. "You have money, a house, everything. I'm only asking for a small share, but you'd rather cling to it than help your own son." I stood there, feeling as if my heart were being squeezed. I had never seen my grandfather like this. His shoulders trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a deeper pain. "Hudson," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "I've given you everything I had. But you didn't need me. You didn't need Nathan. You only need money." The air fell silent, suffocating. My father didn't respond. I heard his heavy footsteps, and then the door slammed shut. I stood behind the door, tears streaming down my face, but I didn't dare cry out loud. For the first time, I understood that my grandfather, the man as strong as a mountain, could also feel powerless. He wasn't just hurting for my father, but because he couldn't change his son, couldn't pull him out of his cold selfishness. The next morning, I saw my grandfather sitting outside on the old wooden chair where my grandmother often sat. He stared out at the garden, where the sunflowers were wilting in the cold wind. His eyes were empty, as if searching for an answer he knew would never come. I stood behind the glass door watching him, feeling the profound loneliness of an upright man who had spent his life defending what was right, but couldn't protect his own heart. Broken heart, the unforeseen storm. The days passed, and I was now 18. A tall, lanky young man with neater brown hair, and a clear dream to become a lawyer like my grandfather. Santa Fe remained my home, but I had begun to see the world through the eyes of an adult. I excelled in school, topped my class, and was preparing to graduate. My grandfather, David Miller, was proud of me, though he rarely said it outright. He showed it through subtle nods, the way he placed his hand on my shoulder after a chess game, or the law books he quietly left on my desk. My grandmother, Willow, was still the light of our home, but that light was growing dimmer. She coughed more often, and her once nimble hands now trembled when holding a teacup. She still tried to tend the garden each morning, but I often saw her resting on the wooden chair, gasping for breath, her smile faint as if to reassure me. My grandfather was worried too. I could see it in the way he looked at her, the way he held her hand longer when helping her up. But both of them tried to maintain a peaceful world for me, shielding me from the storms looming on the horizon. That storm arrived one fierce winter evening. I was studying for final exams when I heard a familiar, resolute knock at the door. It was my father, Hudson, again. His voice echoed from the living room, loud and confident, devoid of any hint of remorse. My grandfather's voice cut through, low and sharp. "Hudson, I can't keep doing this. You have to take care of yourself." I stood quietly behind the door. My father was thinner than before, his face etched with the lines of a man who had lived too fast, too carelessly. My grandfather sat in his armchair, hands clasped tightly, his eyes pained. My grandmother stood nearby, clutching her chest, trying to intervene. "Hudson, please, no more arguing. We're family." "Family?" My father scoffed, his voice cutting like a knife. You love the law more than your family, don't you? You'd rather sit on your judge's bench judging the world than see what your own son needs. Those words hit like a punch. My grandfather stood abruptly, his voice trembling. Hudson, you dare say I don't love you? I gave you everything, but you chose your way of life. A life with no room for Nathan, no room for us. My grandmother stepped forward, trying to calm them, her voice frail. Enough, both of you. Hudson, you. But before she could finish, her face turned pale, and she clutched her chest, her small frame collapsing. I rushed out from my hiding place, shouting, Grandma, what's wrong? My grandfather hurried to her side, catching her, his face ashen, hands shaking. Willow, my love, stay with me, he whispered, his voice breaking with fear. My father stood frozen, his eyes glancing over my grandmother as if she were merely an obstacle. I don't have time for this, he said coldly, and then walked out. The door slammed shut, leaving a deadly silence in its wake. I knelt beside my grandmother, my hands trembling as I dialed emergency services. Please come quickly. My grandma. She's not breathing. I shouted into the phone, tears streaming down my face. My grandfather held her tightly, whispering like a prayer. Willow, don't leave me. Please, God, don't take her. I had never seen him like this. The man who was as strong as a mountain was now just a trembling old man, utterly powerless against his pain. Dove, a final severance. The ambulance arrived, its red lights flashing through the quiet night. Paramedics rushed her onto a stretcher. My grandfather clutched her hand, his lips trembling as he called her name in desperation. They wheeled her into the ambulance, and as the doors closed, the red light swept across my grandfather's pale face. I grabbed his hand. It was cold and trembling, as if his entire world had just crumbled. At the hospital, we sat on cold metal chairs. Time dragged on, heavy and endless. Hours later, a doctor emerged, his face somber. I'm so sorry. We did everything we could, he said slowly. She had a heart attack. We couldn't save her. My grandfather didn't cry. He only nodded faintly, his eyes empty, as if half his soul had just left him forever. 3 days later, my grandmother's funeral was held in a small church in Santa Fe. The townspeople came in droves, bringing flowers and stories of her kindness. But Hudson and Lainey, my parents, were nowhere to be found. I had held on to a sliver of hope that they would come, that my grandmother's death would shake them awake. I called them, my voice nearly pleading, but their voicemail remained silent. An old friend of my grandfather's, Henry, placed a hand on my shoulder, whispering, They don't deserve you, Nathan, and they certainly don't deserve Willow. Their absence was a final knife, severing the last thread tying me to them. I stood by my grandmother's coffin. My grandfather stood beside me, silent, his eyes red-rimmed. For the first time in my life, I saw him cry, silent tears that rolled down his face. Felt like my heart was breaking into pieces. My parents hadn't just abandoned me as a child. They had abandoned my grandmother, the woman who had once opened her arms to them, though they never valued her. That night, as the candles in the church flickered out, I sat alone in my room. In my heart, a silent vow took shape. I would become a defender of justice, not just to punish the guilty, but to ensure no one else would have to endure the helplessness my grandfather and I felt, wounded by the indifference of others. The morning after the funeral, I found my grandfather standing in the kitchen holding a cup of cold coffee. He seemed smaller, as if my grandmother's death had drained a part of his vitality. A few weeks later, he called me into the living room. Nathan, I've decided to retire. His voice was low but clear. A man who couldn't protect the one he loved no longer has the right to sit on the bench. His words stunned me. He had spent over 30 years as a judge, weighing justice with unyielding integrity. But now he chose to step away not out of weakness, but because he felt he had failed at what mattered most, keeping my grandmother with us. From then on, he lived more quietly, spending his days reading the old novels my grandmother had loved or tending to the flowers she had planted in the garden. but I noticed that despite his efforts to keep the garden alive, his eyes always carried a deep sadness, as if he were searching for her shadow in every petal. I didn't know how to ease his pain, so I did the only thing I could. I stayed by his side. I washed dishes, mowed the lawn, and listened to him recount old cases, even though I'd heard them hundreds of times. I became his emotional anchor, just as he and my grandmother had once been mine. In my heart, a silent promise grew stronger. I would continue the path of justice he had walked, not only to uphold what was right, but to protect those like my grandmother, hearts vulnerable to the world's indifference. Man student forging a path. After graduating high school, I was accepted into the University of New Mexico's law school with a full scholarship. The day I received the acceptance letter, I ran home and handed it to my grandfather. He read it, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said simply, "You make me proud, Nathan." But I saw the glint of tears in his eyes, and I knew he wasn't just proud of me. He hoped I would achieve what he felt he had not. The early years of college were a grueling challenge. I wanted to be independent, refusing my grandfather's offers to help with tuition, though he insisted many times. "Nathan, I have savings," he'd said, but I shook my head. "I want to do this myself, Grandpa. I need to prove it to myself." So I worked while studying, waiting tables at a small diner, shelving books at the school library. Some nights I slept only 3 hours, my eyes burning from reading under dim lights. Some days I nearly buckled under the pressure. But each time I thought of my grandfather, of my grandmother, I told myself, I can't give up. My grandfather wrote me letters, handwritten on pale yellow paper, his penmanship as neat as his character. He wrote about old cases, moments when he stood at the crossroads of right and wrong, and the true meaning of practicing law. "Nathan," he wrote in one letter, "justice is not a destination, it's a journey, and sometimes it will break your heart. But remember, you're not walking alone." Those letters were a flame that warmed me on the coldest days. 7 years of law school were 7 years of forging resilience. I learned to rise after every failure, to stay calm under pressure, and to believe in myself. I grew through grief. The pain of losing my grandmother, the pain of watching my grandfather waste away, and the pain of unanswered questions about my parents. But that very grief shaped me into someone steadfast, not just in mind, but in heart. The day I received my law degree, the Santa Fe sun shone brighter than ever. As my name was called, I looked down at the audience where my grandfather sat, still tall and lean, his silver hair gleaming under the lights. He wore his old black suit, but his face lit up with a smile, the first I'd seen since my grandmother's passing. As I stepped down, he hugged me tighter than ever and whispered, "Your grandmother would be so proud, Nathan." Classical building, the deputy prosecutor. I returned to Santa Fe, armed with my law degree and a burning desire to live up to the lessons my grandparents had instilled in me. I was hired as a deputy prosecutor at the district attorney's office, a job filled with pressure but brimming with purpose. Each day, I faced towering stacks of case files, learning to stand in court and defend justice with the integrity my grandfather had etched into my soul. Though retired, my grandfather remained my guiding light. Every evening after grueling hours at work, I returned to the old house, where he still lived, tending to a garden now reduced to a few solitary flowers. We sat in the living room by my grandmother's weathered chessboard, its chipped pieces still carrying the warmth of days gone by. I read case files aloud to him, and we discussed not just the law but ethics, fairness, and the blurry lines between right and wrong. "Being a prosecutor isn't about winning, Nathan," he said one evening. "It's about protecting what's right, even when it breaks your heart. Sometimes you'll face tough choices, but never let your heart lose faith." My colleagues at the office began to respect me, not just for my skill, but for the calm and integrity I brought to my work. I never rushed to convict. Once, I handled a theft case involving a teenager, and seeing the panic in his eyes, I saw a piece of myself, a boy once lost amid unanswered questions. I told my grandfather about it, and he looked at me with gentle eyes. "He doesn't just need justice, Nathan. He needs a chance. Give him what your parents never gave you." I followed his advice, and when the boy sent me a thank you letter, I knew I had done the right thing. The moments with my grandfather were the most beautiful chapters of my life. We weren't just grandfather and grandson. We were friends. A judge who had walked the path of justice and a prosecutor just beginning it. He shared stories of his youth, how my grandmother had made him believe in love, and how he learned that justice wasn't just about laws, but the hearts of those who uphold them. But time waits for no one. My grandfather grew weaker. His dry coughs came more frequently, and sometimes he forgot the name of a book or a story. I worried, but he only smiled. "Don't be afraid, Nathan. I'm old, but my heart is still here with you. Justice is what keeps me alive." Wilted flower, the final pages. One autumn morning, when the soft Santa Fe sunlight filtered through the window, I visited him. The house was strangely quiet. I stepped into the living room and saw him sitting by the window, his head slumped forward, an open diary resting on his lap. My heart clenched. "Grandpa!" I called softly, but he didn't answer. He had passed away peacefully in his sleep, as if he had finally found the peace he'd sought since my grandmother's death. I knelt beside him, tears falling silently. On the diary's final page, his trembling handwriting read, "True justice isn't found in the courtroom, but in the hearts of those who keep believing in it." I closed the diary, kissed his frail hand, and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa, for everything." I knew that from now on, I would walk forward alone, but he and my grandmother would always be in my heart, in every decision, every step I took on the path of justice. In the days following his death, Santa Fe seemed to lose its familiar light. I arranged his funeral with all the care I could muster. The townspeople came in droves. Judges, lawyers, court clerks, and townsfolk, bringing stories of his integrity and compassion. I stood there, listening as they spoke of him. Yet in my heart, I saw only the image of him sitting by the window and the sorrowful look in his eyes when he spoke of my father. Then Hudson and Laney, my parents, appeared. They walked into the church dressed impeccably, as if attending a social event. My father wore an expensive suit, but his face was cold, devoid of grief. My mother glanced at me as if I were a mere acquaintance. They weren't there to bid farewell to my grandfather. They came to scope out what they might gain from his estate. I stayed silent, clenching my fists, focusing on organizing the funeral. They were not my family. My family was my grandparents. The little house with its sunflower garden, the evenings by the chessboard, and the handwritten letters. 2 weeks after the funeral, I sat in the office of Arthur Briggs, a longtime friend of my grandfather. His office, located in downtown Santa Fe, had dark wooden walls and the faint scent of old books. Mr. Briggs, a man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, opened my grandfather's will, his voice steady and clear. My parents sat across from me, their eyes sharp, anticipating a grand prize. I sat quietly, hands resting on my lap, trying not to let my emotions take over. Mr. Briggs began reading, "All my assets, including the house, land, stocks, and savings totaling approximately $4 million, are bequeathed to my grandson, Nathan Miller." He paused, looked at me, and continued, "David left a note. I trust that only this grandson understands the value of integrity." The room grew stifling. I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, my father muttering something under his breath. Then Mr. Briggs went on, "To my son, Hudson Miller, I leave my diary, where I recorded my thoughts and hopes." "A diary?" "He left me an old notebook." Hudson shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "I'll sue. I won't let this kid take everything," he roared. He stormed to the desk, grabbed the diary, and threw it to the floor as if it were worthless, then grabbed my mother's arm and stormed out, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. I quietly bent down and picked up the diary. Its worn leather cover felt familiar, carrying the warmth of my grandfather. That evening, I sat alone in the living room and opened it, reading each line he had written. His thoughts on the law, the cases he had judged, and my father. He wrote of his disappointment in watching Hudson grow into a man driven by selfishness, but also of the quiet love he held for his son, even knowing Hudson might never understand. In every line, I saw a father who had tried, hoped, and failed to teach his son what was right. But I also saw a grandfather who had succeeded with me. I closed the diary, tears falling silently, and understood that he didn't just write about the law, but about the heart of a father. I placed the diary on the shelf beside his old law books, vowing that his teachings would not be forgotten. Balance scale the courtroom battle. Hudson couldn't accept the will. After storming out of the lawyer's office, he grew even more bitter, telling anyone who would listen that I had manipulated my grandfather. My mother, Lainey, stood behind him, egging him on. They hired a slick private attorney, and soon enough, a lawsuit was filed in New Mexico's civil court. Their accusation cut into me like a blade. Nathan Miller unduly influenced and exploited the weakened state of the deceased, David Miller, to alter the will and unjustly claim the estate. The news spread like Santa Fe's wind. Local newspapers blared headlines. Young prosecutor sued by own parents over estate dispute. I never imagined I'd be the center of a lawsuit, especially one brought by my own parents. The district attorney's office had to temporarily suspend me to ensure impartiality. I quietly cleared my desk and braced myself for a battle I didn't want to fight. Judge Marcus Nolan was assigned to preside over the case. When I stepped into the courtroom on the first day, I recognized him. Years ago, my grandfather had taken me to a courtroom where Nolan, then a young clerk, worked. I remembered him saying, "Kid, if you want to do law, remember that justice is never easy, but it's always worth fighting for." Now he sat on the bench, and though we remained silent, I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The trial began in a tense atmosphere. My parents, backed by their lawyer, hurled harsh words, calling me an opportunist. Each word felt like a cut, but I stayed calm, giving a concise, clear testimony. I didn't want the trial to become an emotional battle. I wanted it to be fair, as my grandfather had taught me. My grandfather's diary became the pivotal evidence. Arthur Briggs stood before the court and confirmed that David had written repeatedly about his trust in me and his disappointment in Hudson. Briggs read aloud a passage. "Hudson is my son, but he chose a path I cannot follow. I place my trust in Nathan, not for the sake of wealth, but because he understands that justice is the heart of those who believe in it." Those words silenced the courtroom. Judge Nolan adjourned the trial to review the evidence. As everyone left, I saw him linger, his gaze fixed on a photo of my grandfather on the wall, a picture of him in his judge's robe. His eyes were filled with the sorrow of old memories. I walked out of the courthouse, my heart heavy, but certain that whatever the outcome, I had done what my grandfather would have expected. White heavy check mark the verdict. The day the trial resumed, the courtroom was packed. I sat at the defendant's table, gripping the edge tightly. My parents sat across from me, their elegance now seeming out of place, like a mask that no longer fit. Judge Marcus Nolan entered, his black robe swishing lightly. He began reading the verdict. His voice was deep, clear, and carried a weight that made the room hold its breath. After thoroughly reviewing the evidence and testimonies, the court dismisses the plaintiff's claims in their entirety. The will of David Miller is deemed legal, and the inheritance belongs to Nathan Miller. He paused, looking directly at my parents, then said slowly, "Justice does not side with blood, but with truth." My father bowed his head. My mother turned away, her lips pressed tight in disappointment. I didn't feel triumph, only a creeping sadness. This wasn't what I wanted. A trial that severed me from those who gave me life. But I knew it was what my grandfather wanted. The truth had to be protected, no matter the cost. As the courtroom emptied, I stood holding the diary I had carefully restored. I approached my father, who remained seated, motionless. "Dad," I said, my voice soft but firm, "you should read this diary again, not to apologize, but to understand why Grandpa never stopped loving you." I held out the diary. Hudson looked at me, and for the first time, his eyes held no anger or arrogance. He stayed silent for a long moment, then reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he took the diary. He said nothing, only nodded. A small gesture, a sign of surrender, not to me, but to the truths he had long refused to face. My mother stood behind him, her gaze averted, but she didn't intervene. They left, disappearing through the courtroom doors, leaving me with a strange sense of emptiness. I stepped out of the courthouse, the warm Santa Fe sunlight enveloping me. I stood there, breathing deeply, feeling the sun's warmth and a quiet peace settling in my heart. I knew somewhere my grandfather was smiling. They had taught me that justice isn't just a verdict. It's how we live. The lawsuit didn't just leave scars. It stirred all of Santa Fe. The community turned its judgmental gaze on Hudson and Laney. At the weekend market, the whispers no longer targeted me, but my parents. Rosa, the flower vendor, once took my hand and said, "You're like your grandfather, Nathan. Your parents? They're a disgrace." I overheard other vendors talking, their voices filled with indignation. Hudson Miller, a basketball star suing his own son for money. Unbelievable. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of the story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.